Hi everybody. Welcome to this talk, still the state of Lightning privacy. I'm Elias, I work for Spiral, mostly on the Lightning dev kit. So this talk, the still part here, refers to the fact that this is basically all well-known issues or well-known facts about Lightning privacy research. So this goes back years, but I found that a lot of people in the community are still not aware of certain trade-offs on what's going on. So that's why I thought it was a good thing to refresh these things over time. And in particular now with more and more payment protocols coming into the space, like Arc and Spark and so on, that make different trade-offs, it might be interesting to revisit Lightning's privacy properties. So, because Lightning has the promise to not only be the settlement layer, but maybe also, in part, the privacy layer for these other protocols that are now building on top or beneath Lightning, depending on how you see it or how it will end up implemented. So, speaking of the promise, that will be the first part here. The question is, what is Lightning's privacy model to begin with? So, what set Lightning out to fulfill in the protocol? What properties do we want? The first property here is off-path local unobservability, meaning essentially if you're not part of, if you're not the sender or the receiver of a payment, or you're on the path of a payment, you don't notice the payment at all. You shouldn't get any information that it's actually happening. Secondly, since you don't know anything about the payment, hopefully, you also have total value privacy, because you just don't observe anything changing, and hence you don't know the value of the payment that is going on. You also, Lightning promises to give on-path relationship anonymity, meaning if you're on the path even, then you hopefully get, you shouldn't be as a forwarding node or as an intermediary node on the path, you shouldn't be able to know who sent that. Receivers sender anonymity, that means if you receive a payment, you don't know who paid you, except they give up that information as part of a node or something. And lastly, you have sender's receiver anonymity, which is kind of a new property, which was an extension to the original privacy property with Bolt 12, that now allows that you can actually send to somebody without actually knowing who it is exactly. So you pay an offer, but you don't know where they're located in the network, and you don't necessarily have to know their exact identity. So these are pretty good, I would say, privacy properties overall, given that we actually are able to implement them. And I want to zoom in real quick to the last part here. So how does Bolt 12 fix the new property that was recently added? Well, of course, Bolt 12 is based on blinded paths, so the sender always just learns the introduction node when they send and communicate with a receiver of a payment, and then this is basically onion encrypted here, and you can send to a recipient without actually knowing that. And here is the full handshake. I might skip most of it now because it's rather complicated to say, but in general you can see that Bob can send the offer to Alice out of band, basically in form of a QR code. Alice can then send an invoice request with a blinded path in it to Bob, and then Bob can use that blinded path that Alice gave to reply to the invoice request with the invoice. And lastly, Alice can actually send over the final blinded path that was negotiated here, the actual onion payment, so that at no point in this handshake either party really has to know exactly where it's coming from. Again, there might be caveat, there might be, so to speak, side channel attacks to this. So you might learn through other means, basically, who the sender or receiver that is. But in general, that is the goal of Bolt 12. So just as a quick side note, at least this is screenshotted from a few months back, onion message forwarding, which is the basis for actually forwarding these kind of bulk payments, wasn't hugely widely distributed in the network. Partially because CLN, it's an experimental flag, so please, if you run CLN enable this experimental flag so that your node actually forwards onion messages. And yeah, if you run LND, I would advise you run LNDK, which is a nice project that allows you to be nice to the network and enable onion message forwarding for everybody. But by now I think Maurice's talk is in a bit today that might be very interesting on the LNDK project. They now even managed to get Bolt 12 receive working on LND, which is great. So yeah, just a plug there. But that is great. We now have these pretty good privacy properties of Lightning, and we even extended it over the years, basically the scope of privacy goals. That's awesome. But what are some of the remaining issues we want to look into that we know that researchers discovered over time, that remain for us to actually mitigate, hopefully. So I say some here because this is really focusing on, let's say for example, I only focus on the Lightning parts of things here. I'm not considering any kind of on-chain footprint privacy stuff that Lightning might still suffer from, basically. This is really just in-protocol privacy issues that we might want to do something about it. So this is 3 known issues I want to look into as part of this talk here. The first category of attacks that are known are balance discovery attacks. Essentially, the idea there being you just send payments, and there's different papers and different approaches, but in general, the idea is you essentially probe network channels and you can discover what balance they are. As I note here, it's actually a feature that we kind of require for payment reliability by now. So we discovered over time, in practice, you want to lean on balance discovery attacks, essentially, i.e. Payment probing, to build a model of how liquidity is distributed in the network for reliable payments. But, of course, if being too permissive, or if we allow nodes to probe too aggressively, it might be that they're able to snapshot the network in such frequency that it can actually see where funds move over time in high resolution, and that would break relationship anonymity, basically. That is really the thing that we want to avoid here. And of course, there are certain mitigations and countermeasures to do this. In general, hopefully as network traffic grows, it's just getting unfeasible to really get this kind of resolution in your measurements that you could actually break privacy. That would be a guess, I guess, from my side. But also we have some valves there. We can set the HTLC maximum MSET and HTLC max value in flight limits to set an artificial limit, basically, per HTLC that is forwarded over the network, which kind of limits how much information an attacker can gain per probe they send. So we can make probing harder, but meaning also the privacy discovery there harder, or the attacks on privacy harder. And the third approach would be upfront fees, which is interesting for all other reasons also, but so far it's a bit unclear which approach of upfront fees is very interesting and how we would actually implement them. There's several proposals there, but yeah, I think none so far were really going anywhere. But I would say balance discovery attacks, it's a feature, it's not too bad. So we're coming basically now to the second step in terms of my personal view on severity here, which would be on-path attacks on privacy. So now we are talking about an attacker model where the adversary is actually operating a forwarding node and are part of a sender-chosen path, and they try to estimate who's the sender, who's the receiver of a payment then they can observe. And we showed in research a few years back that is actually feasible to do. here's a quick example. So if Elias here tries to pay Carol, she would choose a path and then would send update at HTLC messages, and an attacker here that operates these two observation points could just record a time t0, let's call it, and then essentially exploiting the way how LND currently deals with certain LND with certain failure or error codes. They could actually fail this HTLC again and lean on Alice retrying over the same path again, and thereby they would get a second timing measurement for the same payment and could therefore calculate this delta here, which gives them their time distance to the sender. And then when they on the second time around, they would forward that HTLC, then let it through, and from the last observation point of any given point in time, they can just record a time t2, and when they get a fulfill or fail or whatever back from the actual destination, they can record the time again and also learn the time distance to the destination. So if they now had built a timing model of basically how far am I as the adversary away from any given destination in the network, they can run a maximum likelihood estimator to estimate, well, which are the most likely sender and receiver endpoints, and they can break privacy through that. For one, we could show in that research a few years back that it really highlighted that a few central nodes really see a lot of payments, simply because they are very, in terms of, they're very central basically in the network, and they would, in our simulations back then, see up to 37% of global payments, a single node, and then the four most central node, if they colluded, would see up to 72% of payments in our simulations back then. We could also show that this timing-based approach is significantly increasing the adversary's chances of actually de-anonymization of senders and receivers, and that of course also depended heavily on where they are positioned in the network. But yeah, so how are we thinking about mitigating this? Well, for one, it clearly highlighted that these kind of attacks would especially be possible for really centralized nodes. So if we increase network decentralization, if we have more hubs, if the ecosystem grows, so to speak, it would mean that we probably not only see more payments and hence more noise, as a bit like we discussed with the balance discovery attacks earlier, but it would also mean that we simply distribute our payment flows over more nodes, and each of them then has just a partial access to less data. That would be a good idea to mitigate that. We can also strengthen path diversity in our routing algorithms. Currently, all routing algorithms are optimizing for fees and then for payment reliability and for a few other factors that we puzzle together basically. But I think there's no implementation currently that actually really emphasizes some kind of randomization aspect. I think CLM at some point, I see Christian back there, I think CLM at some point had some kind of a randomization budget, but I believe they dropped it by now, I'm not entirely sure. But we could definitely go for a more randomized approach where we essentially allow a certain overpayment of fees, or hopefully not too much giving up payment reliability though, just to make sure we're not always taking the shortest, most predictable route, if that makes sense. Because the maximum likelihood estimator of that attacker always is based on the assumption to take basically the cheapest route, essentially. Right, and we can then also add forwarding delays or delays in general to the HTLC flow to just make that not as predictable. Lastly, you can do PTLC at some point to disallow this, or at least this very trivial way how you can match different HTLCs at different observation points. There might be still heuristics, of course, how you can see that two PTLCs are related, just timing-wise or whatever. But currently, of course, if you have multiple observation points, vantage points in the network, the payment hash gives it very clearly away that this is the same payment, and you don't have to do any work actually correlating them. So PTLCs, if ever implemented, would really solve a bunch of issues there. Yeah. So the question here becomes, in terms of severity, is this a reasonable attacker model? And well, you have to run a forwarding node, and you have to operate that node in a network that user would actually use it. So you kind of have to acquire channels. You have to act as a real part of the network to really gain some reputation and so on. So it's doable, certainly. Would I suspect that currently somebody did this? I'm not quite sure, honestly, because I don't want to assume that there are these kind of malicious nodes in the network. There might be, but I'm not aware of anything that really indicates that somebody's actively exploiting these kinds of timing attacks currently. But this is not exactly true for the next level of attacks, basically, I'm going to speak about now, because we're talking here about network level attacks, meaning these are AS level attacks on privacy, where the adversary model is that an adversary is controlling an AS or has access, AS being autonomous system, basically your ISP or a conglomerate of ISP, or maybe even a state level actor that has access to logs from multiple ASs. And in this adversary model, they would observe message pattern. In my eyes, for one, this is the much more severe attacker model, as we'll see in a moment, but this is also the much more realistic attacker model. Because we in fact know, since the nodal revelations, that there are the 5 eyes that actually have access to this kind of data logs. The question is, do they care currently? They have all the data, also hysteric data. So the question is, are they actually looking and building these classifiers to actually look at the lighting data? Is lighting important enough yet? But in terms of just gathering the data, we're pretty sure they have it, basically, and they could do these kinds of attacks. So it's, yeah, the more severe attack vector in my eyes, but also the more realistic one. So the attack vector is really, they log messages as they see encrypted messages, IP packets basically, with tuples of the destination and the type of the message, basically IP address, port of receiver and sender, and the type of the message. And then they can group these kind of patterns by timing correlation to just recover basically which messages are likely belonging together. And they can therefore classify what probably happens and who sends to whom at which timestamp, if that makes sense, and what is probably happening. In particular, this kind of exploits a weakness of the Lightning protocol, the fact that we currently don't pad network messages. We pad the actual onions are padded so that you don't have a length of the update at HTLC. You cannot see essentially how many hops are in a payment path you're paying to. That is great. But the actual network messages are not actually padded to a certain length. So you can, for example, see here that you have a typical open channel, accept channel, funding created, funding signed. So an V1 Lightning channel open handshake here. And if you now just ignore these message names, you can see here that simply the sizes of the network messages there are very distinct. And you can just see this is a very distinct handshake just by the sizes of the network messages, even without being able to look into the actual messages, because they are, after all, noise encrypted on the base layer. But even the more important or interesting case is, of course, and that is even more distinct, is the actual payment sending handshake is sending update HTLC, and then doing the Lightning commitment signed dance, basically commitment signed, revoke an ACK, commitment signed, revoke an ACK, and so on. And you can see also here you have very distinct message sizes that you can easily classify currently. And this is basically a shortcoming of the network protocol in my eyes, at least. And these researchers here that wrote the Revelio papers in 2023 showed that you can actually classify this. So they in their numbers, they showed that the top 5 central ASs, of course, autonomous systems see 80% of observable channels. And of course, the most prominent being Amazon. How can it be else? Otherwise, AWS sees 34% of observable channels alone. And the Revelio simulation showed basically what they call perfect de-anonymization in 32% of cases. So they really showed this is a feasible attack vector, and as I said before, in my eyes, it's the most realistic one. So it's just a question if they actually are interested or no. So what would be countermeasures to this? For one, of course, again, network centralization. So in this case, AS level decentralization can help. Please, if you host a node at Amazon, consider moving to another hoster, self-hosting, whatever, just for the sake of diversity. Message padding, in my eyes, would be a very good idea, and I'll get to that in a second. So that we just get away from that specific pattern and characteristic network message sizing. Also, again, introducing forwarding delays and HTLC batching can help here. Not for the immediate attack vector that the Revelio paper abused, basically, but they still use delays to group the messages together. Their actual main characteristic was the size of the messages, but to be able to detect which of the messages are actually belonging together, they still use delays. They still use timing, basically, and so delays can help to mitigate that. And lastly, what also would help is cover traffic, because these handshakes are also very distinct in the direction you're sending. So if you just try to intersperse cover traffic, it would help a lot. Okay, so where are we at, basically? What is the current work in progress? How do we currently try to come to terms with these open issues? So for one, we currently work on receiver-side delays. The idea there being that forwarding delays, while, as I said, can be helpful with anonymity, nobody really likes forwarding delays. That, like node operators, if you tell them you have to delay by a few hundred milliseconds, they really don't like that idea. Because we all want Lightning to be fast and reliable. And also reliably fast, without a lot of divergence, basically, and a huge deviation in latency. So the idea there being receiver-side delays and being that, as I said before, the sender part of it is basically exploiting LND-specific behavior. Basically, the measurements toward the destination is the more interesting case anyways. So the idea here being we add receiver-side delays, so the receiver itself adds some random delay before actually claiming the payment. And it allows us somewhat to reduce the forwarding delay that we need anyways for HTLC batching, for I/O efficiency, to keep that to, yes, we should randomize it, but we can reduce that, and then we shift that delay onto the receiver, which also makes it much more incentive aligned, basically. So the party that actually would suffer from a privacy or for the de-anonymization attack can or should add that privacy delay, hopefully by default, but it's aligned with what their goals are. And so for this, we opened a spec draft basically for receiver-side delays. It's currently being discussed. And we're working on implementation in LDK to add receiver-side delays. Secondly, message padding is a good idea. There's currently research from researchers that also, I showed here before, there's research ongoing. A few researchers are looking into the trade-offs. Basically, the very naive case would be, well, we pad all messages to the same MTU size, and that would make them uniform and hopefully not distinguishable at all. Of course, there's some exceptions if you have larger packets, but let's assume like we have a standard MTU size from 1,500 bytes, and we can assume that, and we just use that as the padding. And then all are uniformly padded to that size. Benefits there being it's very naive, it's easy to implement. We can, currently the idea would be we just add a odd TLV field to the messages, and you can opt in to that via feature bit, and then you just fill up whatever message you're sending with an odd HTLC field that amounts to up to 1,500 bytes. The question there being, can we do better? Can we gain similar privacy properties while not padding to that full size? Can we do something else, smaller, randomized padding maybe or so, while still having the privacy? In this research is basically ongoing. But in general, a first draft of a spec that we'll be working on shortly will probably just argue we should do MTU size padding as a first approach, and then, as I said, it will be an optional feature anyway, so over time the implementations can just switch to different padding strategy basically without there being any compatibility issues, because being an odd TLV field, the receiver of such a padded messages would discard it anyways, no matter how long it is, basically. And the next topic that we should look into is cover traffic. We haven't really started looking into that yet. There are some ideas. As I said, the research that is ongoing on message padding also showed that we should definitely pad messages, otherwise we're kind of screwed. That is the first thing, but it's also not entirely enough to mitigate especially a bit more advanced classifiers that are multivariate, basically. And if you have classifiers that take directionality of handshakes and so on as an input, they might still be able to pretty reliably detect certain handshakes, basically. So the idea there being we intersperse or introduce cover traffic when needed, basically, also to break up these very distinct handshakes. That could be gossip that we have to send anyways. It could be probes. It could be ping messages if needs to. So there are different ideas how we could, so that it's not entirely wasted bandwidth. But when to do it exactly and how to do it, that is still ongoing, essentially. All right, and this brings me to the end. Just to conclude, generally, the overall privacy model of Lightning is pretty good. The goals are pretty good. Lightning really shows the promise to even be also payment privacy layer for other technologies while being the common connector of other technologies. So I argue we should even lean into considering privacy as a core feature of Lightning, even more than we may already do. There are some unresolved known issues though, and unfortunately in my eyes the most severe known issue is the most plausible also, so we should look into how to mitigate that. Of course there's an ongoing discussion as it's all not interfering, but it's always a trade-off with UX and with overhead and stuff like that, so we should keep that in mind, of course. But to conclude, mitigations are actively being discussed and developed, and there's ongoing research on it. Thank you. Well,
So would that stop this? Well, make the surveillance difficult?
so the question was how do AES level attacks at all matter at all if the nodes would operate on Tor essentially? And there's basically two and a half answers to this. The first being, you can also look into the Revelio paper. They basically model the Tor network as one AES. So depending on how exactly, I mean, you still have a similar issue. Basically, so especially if you're considering exit traffic, also you can still. There you have also your exit nodes are basically your AES also and see all your traffic, so they could even act a bit as an AES level attacker. But also I think in general, while Tor is great, we shouldn't only trust on Tor being readily available and solving our issues for us basically. Tor also has a bunch of known limitations in terms of similar timing issues, traffic confirmation, stuff like that. So it's no silver bullet either. We would rather need some Lupix kind of network to solve this if we really want to build upon something else. But I'd argue we actually want to solve this by our own, because we can create a much more tailored solution that is not delaying everything. Because, for example, I'm not sure if you, I'm not asking that question. When you run a node on Tor, then you might discover it's kind of slow and you get a lot of delay. So hopefully we get to something that is maybe similarly private, maybe, I don't know, but at least maybe better performing than that, because we can create a lightning-specific tailored solution. Yeah.
Hey, we got to wrap it there, because upstairs in just a moment is the hackathon judging finals presentations, an award ceremony. So please, another thanks for Tinal, and let's all head upstairs. Thank you.